Welcome. We are opening the file today on a specific shocking moment in true crime history that continues to baffle legal experts and fascinate the public decades later.
We are.
We're going to be analyzing the documents and source materials pertaining to the 1980 killing of Betty Gore and the subsequent trial and acquittal of Candy Montgomery.
The materials we've reviewed, they detail this highly improbable narrative of a suburban homemaker who was accused of committing an act of extreme, sustained violence against a close friend.
Right.
So our mission here is really an analytical one. We have to examine the facts presented in these records, the social context, the specific legal strategies that were deployed, and a highly controversial outcome to really understand the mechanics of this case and why this story just refuses to leave the cultural conversation.
Absolutely. The tension at the core of this entire legal saga is it's astonishing. We're talking about Candy Montgomery, who was known in her community as an active, devout church member.
A pillar of the community, really.
And she was accused of striking her friend, Betty Gore, a staggering 41 times with a wood-splitting axe. Yet a jury ultimately found her not guilty, accepting a plea of self-defense.
And that successful defense, given the horrific physical evidence, that is the central puzzle piece we have to meticulously unpack, fact by documented fact.
It just demands such a rigorous, critical examination.
It does. When you're dealing with something of this gravity, it's essential to set aside the profound emotional reaction the verdict provoked, both back in 1980 Texas and today, and to focus strictly on the chronology of reported events, the psychological testimony that was admitted, and the judicial process that rendered that extraordinary acquittal.
Okay, let's unpack this by truly setting the scene first. I think we have to immerse ourselves in the seemingly idyllic environment where this catastrophic failure of human relations unfolded.
Yeah.
The sources bring us right back to the late 1970s and 1980.
The sources immediately transport us to Wiley, Texas, specifically Collin County. At that time, this area sort of epitomized the promise of the American suburban ideal.
It was all about community safety.
A very defined social structure.
That suburban setting is more than just geography, though, isn't it? It's the critical frame for the whole story.
It is. The sources detail the Montgomery family structure. Candace Lynn Wheeler, born in 1949, was around 30 years old at the time. She was married to Pat Montgomery, who was an electrical engineer.
And they were actively building a life there, not just passing through. They moved to Collin County around 1977, establishing roots and raising their two children, a daughter and a son. They weren't just residents, they were integrated, active participants in the community's sort of moral framework.
And, as the sources clearly emphasize, the primary pillar of that framework was the local church.
Right.
Both the Montgomerys and the Gores were deeply involved members of the Methodist Church of Lucas.
Yeah.
This shared devotion, it solidified their social standing, but it also provided the intimate venue for their relationships to develop and, ultimately, to completely fracture.
That church connection is fundamentally important, isn't it? It's how Candace Montgomery and the victim, Betty Gore, who worked as a middle school teacher, how they became close friends.
They shared social circles, community duties, the assumed bond of faith.
And this closeness just adds a profound layer of tragedy and, eventual betrayal to the entire narrative.
The friendship sets the foundation, but the sources are very clear about the explosive catalyst here.
The affair.
The affair. Candace Montgomery engaged in a secret extramarital affair with Alan Gore, Betty Gore's husband. The contrast between their public, devout lives and this private, secretive infidelity is the immediate source of tension in the story.
And it wasn't a fleeting thing. It was a relationship that developed over time, starting right under the nose of their community.
Yes.
What we learn from the material, though, is that this infidelity had actually ceased by the time of the fatal incident.
And that detail that the affair had, according to Montgomery's own account, already ended, that's crucial for analyzing the defense's argument about motive.
How so?
Well, if the affair was over, the defense could then argue the confrontation wasn't about some ongoing passion or revenge, but perhaps residual anger and an emotional violence on Betty Gore's part.
Ah, okay.
The sources paint this picture of surface-level domestic tranquility that's just masking these deep-seated secrets and resentments. This was a powder keg disguised as a pristine suburban home.
And it was this simmering resentment, this quiet, concealed volatility that led directly to the shocking events of June 13, 1980.
Precisely. To fully appreciate the case, we have to recognize that the social atmosphere of Wiley wasn't just physical, it was psychological.
You mean the pressure to conform?
Exactly. It was a place where people lived in close proximity and adhered to these really rigid social rules, meaning any crack in that facade-like an affair was inherently more dangerous when it was exposed.
Let's expand on this pre-incident atmosphere for a moment. The sources describe Betty Gore as a woman who was often struggling, maybe with anxiety or depression, and dealing with the emotional aftermath of postpartum struggles, and also suspicions about her husband's fidelity. So this wasn't a purely antagonistic relationship between the two women before the confrontation. It was complex, interwoven by shared community and this deep underlying stress.
That complexity is vital. If we simplify Betty Gore merely as the victim and Candy Montgomery as the friend who had the affair, we miss the nuance that the defense later exploited.
So the defense used that complexity.
Oh, absolutely. They sought to humanize Montgomery's state of mind while simultaneously suggesting Betty Gore was the aggressor, fueled by months, perhaps years, of domestic stress and suspicion.
So the affair didn't just end.
The emotional residue lingered, particularly for Betty, who likely felt betrayed by both her husband and her friend.
And the sources, by detailing the tight community of the Methodist Church of Lucas, they underscore that even small disagreements or exposed secrets could have enormous social repercussions.
For both women, the stakes in any confrontation about the affair were extremely high. They stood to lose not just their marriages, but their entire social standing in Wiley.
It creates a pressure cooker scenario.
And that pressure cooker had its lid blown clean off on that day in June 1980.
So we need to firmly establish the precise timeline and the logistical circumstances surrounding the incident itself. The sources confirm a crucial detail. On June 13th, 1980, Alan Gore, the husband, was out of town.
His absence is the first domino, as you say. Alan was away, and when he tried repeatedly to call his wife Betty, he couldn't get an answer.
Which is the common worried husband scenario, but here it tragically sets the entire discovery process into motion.
It does. The sources detail his growing concern. When calls went unanswered for a prolonged period, Alan reached out to neighbors, requesting that they go to the residence to check on Betty.
And those neighbors, when they arrived, they had to force their way into the family home.
It was inside that quiet, familiar suburban house that they made the devastating discovery: the body of Betty Gore. The sources must be respected for the tragic nature of this finding, emphasizing the profound loss of life.
And here is where the facts documented in the source material become just profoundly difficult to process. This is the detail that stunned the community and continues to define the case.
The 41 times.
Betty Gore was struck 41 times with a wood-splitting axe. That number 41, it's not just physical evidence, it's a narrative statement in and of itself.
The sheer brutality inherent in that detail is it's undeniable and unshakable. To be struck even once is an act of fatal violence.
Of course.
But 41 strikes imply a sustained, frenzied attack far beyond the scope usually associated with initial self-defense. The task for the legal system then became reconciling this physical reality with the testimony of the only survivor.
The sources also compel us to discuss an equally heartbreaking detail regarding the immediate aftermath concerning the Gore's youngest child, their daughter Bethany. This detail just underscores the profound tragedy and the duration of the horror.
It's truly a central context. Bethany, the Gore's young daughter, was found in her crib in a nearby room.
And the sources specify the devastating timeline. It had taken approximately 13 hours for the body to be discovered.
13 hours.
13 hours. And during that time, Bethany was alone, awake, crying, and according to the documents, covered in her own feces. That detail. It speaks to the desperate isolation and suffering of an innocent child, a secondary victim trapped within the aftermath of this violence, just waiting for someone to find them.
It's just awful to even think about.
It reinforces the absolute devastation inflicted upon this family structure. This wasn't just a crime. It was an act that shattered every sense of order and security in that home.
And the initial investigation was subsequently launched, led by Steve Deffibaugh with the Collin County Sheriff's Department.
Right.
The paper trail confirms that Candace Montgomery was ultimately apprehended less than 2 weeks later on June 26, 1980.
And the identification of Montgomery quickly transformed the case from a mysterious tragedy into a clear, albeit complex, criminal investigation focused on the social collision between these two friends.
The rapid apprehension, given the nature of the weapon and the sheer number of strikes, it signaled that the authorities viewed this as premeditated or, at the very least, an act of extreme rage.
But the justice system, as we know, often has a different timeline and a different set of rules for interpretation.
And this move into the formal legal environment produced the highly controversial outcome that necessitates our focused analysis today.
Moving into the courtroom, the sources detail that the stage was set in the old Collin County Courthouse in McKinney, Texas. The trial, presided over by District Judge Tom Ryan, lasted a notably brief 8 days.
Which is surprising, really.
When you consider the complexity of the relationships and the horrifying physical evidence, 8 days suggests a highly focused or perhaps rushed presentation of evidence.
The legal teams were a fascinating study in strategy. Montgomery was defended by an unconventional duo. Don Crowder, who was reportedly known more for civil law, partnered with Robert Udashin, the defense expert.
And facing them was District Attorney Tom O'Connell. The stakes were immediate and immense.
They were.
Montgomery's plea was direct and confrontational. Not guilty to the charge of first-degree murder.
Which, given the admission that she was the one who wielded the axe, the entire defense had to pivot on one single high-stakes claim.
Self-defense.
Self-defense.
Yeah.
The sources meticulously outline Montgomery's narrative. She went to the Gore home that morning, purportedly to pick up a swimsuit for the daughter. Betty Gore confronted her immediately about the affair with Alan.
And according to Candy,
According to her, Gore then left the room, returned with the wood-splitting axe, and attacked her first. Montgomery stated that during the struggle, she managed to gain control of the weapon and was compelled to use it, fearing for her life, after Gore attempted to strike her moments before.
Now, this is where the prosecution faced its first major hurdle thanks to crucial pretrial evidence that the defense leveraged brilliantly.
The polygraph test.
Montgomery underwent a polygraph test prior to the trial.
And that test, as reported in the sources, indicated she was being truthful regarding her account of the event, specifically the claim that Betty Gore was the initial aggressor with the axe.
Which is huge.
It's massive. While polygraphs in many modern jurisdictions are often inadmissible due to concerns about reliability, the fact that this test was performed and supported her claim provided an enormous psychological advantage to the defense.
It created a powerful narrative hook, didn't it? The defense could stand up and essentially say, we have verifiable proof outside of her verbal testimony that she is telling the truth about being attacked first.
Exactly. Even if the polygraph result was legally shaky, its weight in the court of public and, crucially, jury opinion was immense.
It immediately shifted the perception of who was the victim and who was the aggressor in that initial moment.
And the defense then focused on justifying the terrifying continuation of the violence. This brings us to the most critical nugget of knowledge that explains the acquittal, the psychological testimony.
Right, the expert testimony.
The defense introduced expert testimony, often attributed to psychiatrist Dr. Fred Fasson, who examined Montgomery.
This is the moment that truly defines how 41 strikes could equate to self-defense in a courtroom. What exactly did this expert testimony claim?
Dr. Fasson's analysis centered on the concept of dissociation, or, as it was often termed in the case documents, a panic frenzy.
A panic frenzy.
Montgomery reported that during the struggle, as Gore was allegedly shushing her, a specific action that triggered repressed childhood trauma related to her mother, she experienced a flashback, or a dissociative state.
So the argument wasn't just physical self-defense, it was psychological self-defense, compounded by trauma.
Exactly. The defense posited that once the struggle began and Montgomery was defending herself, the combination of the physical threat and this psychological trigger sent her into a fugue state.
Go ahead.
In this state, she continued striking Betty Gore not out of malice or conscious intent, but because her mind had disconnected from reality, perceiving the immediate threat as a continuous existential danger that required endless force to stop.
That is an extraordinarily sophisticated and, I would think, risky strategy. It attempts to redefine the legal concept of intent.
It does.
It says, yes, she did the act, but she was not of sound mind or conscious intent when the majority of the blows occurred.
And this framework was the only viable way to counter the prosecution's powerful evidence. District Attorney Tom O'Connell focused his counter-argument on two classic legal principles, necessity and proportionality.
Okay, let's start with necessity. O'Connell argued that even if the initial strike was defensive, Montgomery had the option to flee the scene instead of continuing the attack.
Of course. Legally, the use of lethal force is only necessary when retreat is impossible or unsafe. If she had control of the axe, she could have run out the door.
So how did the defense counter that?
They successfully countered this by arguing that in a state of panic or dissociation, the concept of a measured, safe retreat simply doesn't exist. They argued that once the physical confrontation began, Montgomery was locked into a life-or-death struggle, and the possibility of flight was negated by the psychological state of fight.
So they presented the violence as one singular, continuous event.
Yes, not 41 separate opportunities to reassess and escape.
The second and arguably stronger point for the prosecution was proportionality, which connects directly back to that shocking number. How did they justify 41 strikes?
Right. O'Connell argued that such overkill was wildly disproportionate. If self-defense requires only the necessary force to neutralize the threat, why the subsequent 35 or 40 strikes?
And this is where the dissociation testimony earned its weight.
It's the whole ballgame. The defense successfully argued that because Montgomery was in a dissociated state, the act of striking became an autonomous, unthinking reflex, a continuation of the initial justifiable defense. They were essentially arguing that the physical evidence of 41 strikes was evidence of panic, not premeditation.
It was a successful blurring of the line between what is legally necessary and what a person in extreme duress might be psychologically capable of.
It's a complex legal tightrope. They were conceding the brutality but challenging the definition of murderous intent.
And the jury had to decide. Did the first strike justify the use of force, or did the 40 subsequent strikes prove that the threat had been neutralized and the attack had become criminal?
And the jury's rapid decision tells us exactly what they believed. The verdict was delivered on October 30, 1980. The sources note the jury composition: 9 women and 3 men.
And after deliberating for just over 3 hours, an incredibly short time for a first-degree murder charge, they found Candace Montgomery not guilty.
Not guilty.
3 hours. That speed suggests that the defense's narrative, specifically the combination of the polygraph result establishing credibility and the psychological testimony explaining the frenzy, successfully neutralized the shocking physical evidence.
It seems so. The jury accepted the legal argument that her actions, however extreme, were legally justifiable under the claim of self-defense fueled by dissociation.
The outcome was a stunning legal victory for the defense, showing the power of successfully introducing a psychological state to mitigate the severity of overwhelming physical evidence.
But the legal victory did not translate into public acceptance, which immediately opened the volatile next chapter.
The source materials emphasized the enormous criticism that the verdict received from the local community and the media at large. For many, the gulf between the violence committed and the result of not guilty was simply too vast to bridge.
The public outrage was visceral. The scene outside the old Collin County Courthouse following the acquittal was reported in stark terms.
What happened?
Crowds gathered and chanted, "Murderer! Murderer!" as Montgomery exited the courthouse. This public outcry demonstrates that while the jury accepted the judicial reality, the community overwhelmingly rejected the finding on a profound moral and emotional level.
This reaction highlights a fundamental divide, doesn't it? The courtroom only deals in legal truth, intent, evidence, and statutes, but the public demands a human truth.
A motivation and an outcome that makes sense within a moral universe.
Absolutely. The case shattered the illusion of suburban safety. When violence erupts within a closely knit, church-affiliated community and the perpetrator walks free, the public often perceives a failure of justice, regardless of the legal precision of the verdict.
And the sources provide a profoundly poignant and reflective statement from the victim's father, Bob Pomeroy, which captures the unresolved nature of the case far better than the legal texts ever could.
What did he say?
Pomeroy's statement speaks volumes about the lack of closure. He said directly, "As far as I'm concerned, justice will be served. She has to live with it. I wouldn't say I was happy with the verdict. We don't know what happened, and we never will know what happened."
That sentiment, "we don't know what happened and we never will know what happened," it just encapsulates the essential ambiguity that persists.
It really does.
The court required a verdict, but it failed to deliver a mutually accepted factual narrative about the precise escalation of the fight. Only one person survived to tell the tale, and that tale was wrapped in these psychological defense mechanisms.
And Pomeroy acknowledged that while the state acquitted her, she still carried the moral and psychological burden of the act itself. His words suggest a shift from seeking criminal punishment to accepting a kind of internal, lifelong consequence.
The legal system found a legal truth self-defense, but the physical and emotional truth of the confrontation, particularly why it spiraled into 41 strikes, remains obscured.
It does.
On a personal note, the sources briefly trace the trajectory of Candy Montgomery's life post-acquittal. She and her husband, Pat Montgomery, eventually divorced in 1986, several years after the trial concluded.
And this divorce provides a final contextual note on the dissolution of the entire life structure that facilitated and framed the crime. The suburban ideal was officially shattered.
The trial's outcome and the surrounding public fury ensured that this case would not be relegated to local Collin County archives. Its sensational elements, the church, the suburb, the axe, the acquittal, guaranteed its longevity as a cultural narrative.
And that enduring longevity leads us directly to the multiple ways the media has attempted to process and reinterpret the facts for decades.
This is where the story gets fascinating from a cultural perspective. Why does this specific 1980 incident involving two friends in Wiley, Texas, repeatedly find its way back onto our screens and bookshelves?
The sources confirmed that the shocking combination of domestic normalcy and extreme violence ensured its status as a cultural touchstone.
The resonance stems from its ability to tap into these profound American anxieties, doesn't it? The idea that a life built on piety and suburban conformity could shatter with such explosive, inexplicable violence is deeply unsettling.
It challenges the fundamental assumption that we can truly know our neighbors, or even ourselves.
The source materials document the story's evolution, starting with the immediate literary adaptation, the 1984 book Evidence of Love, a true story of passion and death in the suburbs by Dallas-based journalists John Bloom and Jim Atkinson, established the foundational, detailed narrative that captured the public's imagination.
That book was crucial. It wasn't just crime reporting. It delved into the sociological context, giving the suburban setting the weight it deserved. It solidified the key psychological elements and the court drama that fueled the subsequent screen adaptations.
The first major screen adaptation came in 1990 with the CBS TV movie A Killing in a Small Town. Critically, the sources note that this production used fictionalized names. The lead character was Kathy Morrison, played by Barbara Hershey.
And this early approach is highly significant. By fictionalizing the names, the producers were able to engage with the thematic elements, the violence, the secrecy, the suburban facade, without being strictly bound to the specific, controversial details of the Gore and Montgomery families.
And it worked. The fact that Barbara Hershey won an Emmy and a Golden Globe for the role demonstrates the immediate dramatic power of the underlying story, even when slightly distanced from the real names.
The power of the story endured, but the sources show a fascinating shift in the 2020s. We saw a sudden, rapid resurgence of interest with two major streaming adaptations released in quick succession.
Right, with the real names this time.
Indeed. The 2022 Hulu series, Candy, starring Jessica Biel, and the 2023 Max series, Love and Death, featuring Elizabeth Olsen, both returned to the real names and focused explicitly on the historical figures.
And this shift from fictionalized drama to high-profile true crime miniseries, it reflects the evolution of the genre itself, doesn't it?
That's a critical distinction.
Why the sudden need, 4 decades later, to return to the real names and explicitly frame it as true crime rather than fictionalized drama?
It speaks directly to the unresolved nature of the case. Modern audiences, steeped in true crime analysis, they're less interested in the general theme of suburban secrets and more interested in the specific mechanical breakdown.
The psychological testimony, the legal maneuvers.
And the search for the why that the original trial never fully answered. These recent adaptations are attempts to fill the vacuum created by Bob Pomeroy's observation. We don't know what happened.
So what these portrayals collectively offer us is a repeated opportunity to re-examine the established facts. The affair, the 41 strikes, the polygraph, the dissociation defense, and attempt to construct a psychological narrative that makes the outcome palatable, or at least understandable.
They function as cultural attempts to retry the case, with the benefit of historical distance. The ongoing fascination confirms that the legal verdict of not guilty was, for most observers, profoundly unsatisfactory. The public keeps demanding that the emotional reality of that laundry room confrontation be revealed.
And we must remain anchored to the sources, reminding ourselves that while media interpretations seek the emotional truth, our analysis focuses on the specific facts that were presented to the jury, the legal framework that allowed the self-defense plea to succeed despite the horrific physical evidence.
Focusing on those elements, the successful introduction of the psychological context and the weight of the polygraph is essential to understanding the judicial outcome. The jury was faced with a chilling dilemma. Accept the psychological argument that explained the 41 strikes as panic reaction, or reject it and find the defendant guilty of murder, which might contradict the polygraph results suggesting she was initially attacked.
It was an exceptionally difficult tightrope walk for them.
It was.
It seems the defining characteristic of this case isn't the crime itself, but the judicial outcome. The moment the legal system said this was justifiable, while the moral system of the community recoiled.
That's a perfect way to put it.
As we conclude this exploration, let's briefly summarize the critical facts established in the source materials. We know Betty Gore was killed on June 13, 1980, struck 41 times with an axe.
We know her friend, Candy Montgomery, admitted the act but successfully pleaded self-defense, leveraging a psychological defense based on trauma and dissociation.
We know a polygraph test supported her claim of being the initial victim. And we know that despite the prosecution's forceful arguments about the disproportionate nature of the attack, a jury returned a verdict of not guilty in a surprisingly short time.
The careful examination of the materials reveals that the legal outcome hinged not on denying the act, but on redefining the intent. The physical evidence, the 41 strikes, screamed of rage.
Yes.
But the successful introduction of the testimony surrounding the panic frenzy allowed the jury to legally categorize that rage as an overwhelming, involuntary reaction to a credible, immediate threat.
It leaves us with a truly enduring question about the nature of justice, where the technical, legal mechanism provided closure, but the human facts remained intensely disturbing.
And that returns us to the words of the victim's father, Bob Pomeroy. We don't know what happened, and we never will know what happened. The continuous cycle of media adaptations, the books, the movies, the series decades later, proves that the public remains profoundly unsatisfied with that ambiguity.
Which leads to a final thought.
The fact that Hollywood keeps producing these high-profile attempts to retell this story raises a final question for you, the listener. If the courtroom failed to deliver a universal truth, is the continued cultural fascination with the Candy Montgomery case ultimately rooted in a collective, ongoing search for the emotional narrative, the psychological why, that the law could never truly account for?
Thanks for listening.